I want to say some things that are very personal to me. And first, that this is the first time that I've worn this uniform since my late wife's funeral in 2019. In fact, it was still in the same wrap when it was all over and done with. And if you don't know, I'm a resident of the Hudson area, and most people know me actually from MSNBC television, where I was a political commentator in intelligence and counterterrorism. And if I walk down Warren Street, that's where they know me from. But it's more important to me that I know you and you know me as your neighbor. And I know several of you, almost everybody here in the VFW and the Legion. I'm your neighbor. And it honors me to help me honor the people of this community who have given the ultimate sacrifice and who have served and died. What I found fascinating when I bought my house out in Stockport was how this one tiny little village that I lived in had a deep, deep military history. Now, as it was said, I'm from Philadelphia. I was born and raised in a Navy family. Unfortunately, it was Army from 1864 until 1944. So, it makes Army-Navy Day game very difficult in my household. But more important is the fact that when I was in high school, I actually had a crisis of faith. I didn't know what I was going to do. Every male in my family had served in the Navy. My poor, blessed mother had 7 of us in at one time, if you can just imagine that. But I was on the fence about going in. My father said, you have to. Every Nance has served in the armed forces. So I was taking a walk in downtown Philadelphia, and I went down to Independence Hall. And behind Independence Hall, there's a square that's just catty corner off the rear block. And it's called Washington Square. And I had never been to Washington Square. I'd grown up in Philadelphia, never been there. Washington Square, when I went into the park, they had signage there, was the former grave site of the slaves that helped build Philadelphia and served during the period of the American Revolution. And I found that fascinating, that I was standing on a grave site of my ancestors. But what was more fascinating is when I walked in further, I saw there was a large statue and monument. And it was a statue of George Washington with a large wall behind him. And the interpretation board said, this site, Washington Square, is actually a burial ground for 1,500 men who died in Valley Forge during the American Revolution. And what they did, they would bring them by cart from Valley Forge, try to treat them in Philadelphia, and they would die from disease, starvation, the cold, frostbite. And I'm from Philadelphia, and I know how cold it can get there. And they were buried in this park right behind Independence Hall. Most people don't know that. But more important was what was written on the statue behind George Washington. First, there's an eternal flame that sits in front of him because this was the site of the first unknown soldier of the American Revolution, from the American Revolution. It was the first place they honored an unknown soldier. And when the unknown soldier monument was built in Washington, D.C. at Arlington Cemetery, they bought a soldier from this mass gravesite to Washington to be honored as the representative of the American Revolution. As the sign says, unknown only but to God. And I felt very honored that my city, where I was from, represented in this fashion. And I was 17, and I knew almost instantly that I was going to follow my family's tradition and go in the military, go into the Navy. But one other thing struck me while I was there, and I didn't realize how important it was to me until I was deep in my career in the intelligence community. And that was what was written behind Washington's head. And what was written were these words: freedom is a light for which many men have died in darkness. We owe an enormous debt of gratitude every day to be able to do anything that we choose in this country. We didn't build it. We're just living the legacy of the people who gave their lives to build this. Interestingly, I come from a very small village just outside of town here, and it has a fascinating history. In fact, Stockport and the village of Stottville, the hamlet of Stottville, was founded by a guy named Jonathan Stott in 1823. But in 1812, he was a British Army sergeant who was fighting in the Battle of Lundy's Lane in the War of 1812, and he was captured because he was wandering around in a red uniform in the Adirondacks. He and his squad were captured. He was brought to Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and when he was in Pittsfield, someone came through and said, "Have any of you ever operated a British wool loom?" And he's from this town of Stockport, England, where I've been. I visited that village, that town. It's all wool mills there, even today. And he said, "Yeah, I've operated these wool mill looms." And they said, "If you come and help us, we will get you a parole and you will get out of this prison." And that's exactly what he did. And he stayed in the United States after the War of 1812. And he founded one of the first wool mills down on 2nd Street, 2nd and Warren, during that period between 1812 and 1823. In 1823, he went out to what's now Stockport. He bought land from the Van Rensselaers family and started what would become a megalith, massive series of wool mills. By the Civil War, he'd be the equivalent of a billionaire. But what's more interesting is that he had a grandson. His grandson was named Arthur Curtis Stott. Arthur Curtis Stott went into the U.S. Navy in 1905 and got a commission to go to the U.S. Naval Academy. And he was in the graduating class of 1905, so I guess he would have been there in 1901. And if anyone knows anything about naval history, if you don't know anything about naval history, I'm going to teach you something. Every admiral, commander, and famous personality who went to the U.S. Naval Academy and fought in World War II came from the class of 1905. Chester Nimitz, the commander of U.S. forces in the Pacific, was Arthur Curtis Stott's classmate. His best man at his wedding was Arthur Radford, who would be the commander of all U.S. forces in the Atlantic, including D-Day, and landing at Normandy. He himself would go on, and by 1940 would become the commander of all reserve training in World War II. Under his tutelage, he trained almost 500,000 naval officers and personnel in the Second World War from the tiny village of Stottville. Now, as you all know, I'm an intelligence guy, right? We hate the word spy. It's not a great word, even though I'm on the board of the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. But we have another person who comes from Stockport, who by some fluke in history has a monument that sits in my front yard. And his name was Jasper Holmes. And if any of you ever heard of Holmquist Farms out in Stockport, that is where he was born and raised, out on Route 9, near, I guess the intersection of Atlantic Avenue, somewhere out there is the Holmes Farm. And one day I went out and wandered out to the War Memorial, and I said, "What's this new plaque they have here?" So I looked at it and I thought, John Jasper Holmes, I know this name, and it doesn't say anything about him. It doesn't say anything about what he did. In the period after Pearl Harbor, the United States was struggling to fight the Japanese. And the people who were at the key tippy point of that struggle were a group of cryptologists, code breakers, including two. Captain Layton, who was the commander of intelligence for the U.S. Pacific Fleet, And one of his staff was a man by the name of Jasper Holmes from Stockport, New York. And on his intelligence staff, under the command of a man named Rochefort, a lieutenant commander named Rochefort, quite possibly the most brilliant code breaker in the US, who also used to play poker in the 1930s with a young Japanese naval officer named Hiroku Yamamoto. So in this cave, literally a cave in Hawaii, sat three men, one of whom used to play poker with the supreme commander of the Japanese Navy who attacked Pearl Harbor. He was fluent in Japanese. And in the run-up to that, they were trying to break the codes to figure out what the Japanese were doing, because clearly there was a big operation. That big operation would become the Battle of Midway. But before there was a Battle of Midway, Rochefort had been cracking Japanese codes, and he got down to, he could not figure out where two letters that the Japanese were using, AI. He could not figure out what the geographic location of it was. And a young lieutenant on his staff came up with the brilliant idea of saying, hey, the Japanese read our codes, let's send out messages that would be unique for each site, and it would tell us where they're talking about invading. They sent one to the Philippines, they sent one to Midway Island, and they sent a third to Aleutian Islands off of Alaska. The Japanese said, there is a water problem at AI, which was Midway Island. And the entire Japanese fleet was steaming towards it, including all 6 of their aircraft carriers. And it was a young lieutenant from Stockport, New York, who has a memorial in front of my house, who was a code breaker like me, who cracked the code that saved hundreds of thousands of lives and had us destroy the Japanese fleet at Midway. Right here. None of that is on his plaque. Oh, I'm going to change that. Okay. I mean, that's just amazing. One of the key people who destroyed the Japanese fleets from Stockport, New York, just past the Walmart. We are all here to honor sacrifice, and I know I've spoken on because you guys know I can talk for hours. I'm famous for this. But these sacrifices are all personal to us. I cherish every time I walk past that little monument. You know? Oh, by the way, he wrote a book called Double-Edged Secrets. It was mandatory for us to read this book. It was about how they broke codes in World War II. Guy's plaque is in my front yard. But it's more important for us to remember why they did this. It wasn't just about freedom. You know, there's a saying, the British die for honor, the French die for love, the Americans die for freedom. And that's true. But more importantly, it was about allowing you, your children, your grandchildren, to live within that freedom. We have a lot of people right now who are concerned about where this country's going. And somebody said, oh, Malcolm, don't make your speech political. Wars are political. But we've already had our Civil War. We have resolved that we are one people. Amen. One team, one fight is what we say in the armed forces. I don't care. I care that you remember how we got here. I don't care about you remembering me. I love that plaque in my front yard. It represented everything that led me to my career. Everything. One young lieutenant from Stockville saved the Pacific Ocean. That is what you need to remember. People from small towns everywhere give their lives for you. And none of you, no matter how long you served, no matter what you've done, have the right to take that away from any of them, no matter which side of the political aisle you're on. We are one nation. Amen. 152 years of black service members is what my family represents. You know, my great-great-granduncle died on patrol as a Buffalo soldier. He got an inner ear infection, fell off his horse, and later died. He's buried in the military cemetery in Kansas. I am so proud of that. And I'm more proud that you are here. Now, see, I went long. But I want to thank you. I want to thank all of you in the high school. I just want to let you know, the Armed Forces has a band program. They will pay you boatloads of money to dress in a uniform and do exactly what you're doing. Just FYI. So thank you for coming. God bless every one of you. God bless this wonderful country that I'm proud to say that I was allowed the privilege of serving in. And have a good day.